Hello, everyone, and welcome to another of our SFP at EQ seminars. Today, we are featuring Dr. Erica Kuligowski. She's going to talk about interdisciplinary research and how it can be used to protect people exposed to bushfires. She's going to introduce herself. So with no further ado, we are honored to have you here, Erica. It's all yours.
Great, thank you. I'm gonna just share my screen here. And please let me know if you can see that.
Yeah, it's all working.
Perfect. Okay, well, thanks for attending today. It's Friday afternoon for me. I don't know what time it is for you, whoever is attending around the world, but today I'm excited to talk to you about how interdisciplinary research can be used to protect people exposed to bushfires when social science meets engineering. And so my name is Erica Kuligowski. I'm a Vice Chancellor Senior Research Fellow in the School of Engineering at RMIT University. Before I get started, I am calling in from Melbourne, Australia. So I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners of the lands on which the university stands, and I am presenting to you today. RMIT University respectfully recognizes elders past, present, and future. So what will I be talking about today? I'll give a brief introduction on me, and then I'll get into my research motivation. Why am I studying bushfire evacuation? I'll talk about specific evacuation topics and some projects I'm working on, and I will end with some takeaways. So, who am I? As I mentioned, I'm working in the School of Engineering. I'm actually in the Civil and Infrastructure Engineering discipline at RMIT. My background is in both fire safety or fire protection engineering from the University of Maryland. I have a bachelor's and a master's from there, as well as my PhD in sociology from the University of Colorado at Boulder. And so I just started at RMIT a little under a year ago in October of last year. And before that, I spent 18 years in the engineering laboratory at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And there I worked doing quite a number of post-disaster, post-fire research projects, studies, investigations to understand a lot about the hazard, its impacts, and especially its impacts on the people. So I focus a lot of my research on decision-making and response behavior of people under imminent threat, the role of emergency communications in evacuation and public response, as well as evacuation modeling. So as I mentioned, at NIST, I was involved in quite a number of different disaster or fire-related investigations and studies. And these were always interdisciplinary studies with engineers, social scientists, and other researchers. And we were interested in understanding the behavior of the hazard and its impacts on the buildings and infrastructure systems, as well as on the people. And so I was primarily focusing on the decisions that people make and the actions that they take to protect themselves from the hazard or from the disaster. And it's not just understanding the decisions. I was also interested in understanding why people made certain decisions or took certain actions and how what they did impacted them, including whether or not they were injured and also deaths in the community as well. And I did this through open-ended interviews, in-depth interviews, questionnaires or surveys, and focus groups with survivors, as well as family and friends of victims, and individuals responsible for communicating with the public. And so those could be emergency managers, the US National Weather Service, for example, people from the media. And also, as part of these studies, I used computer simulation models, primarily in the building fire studies of the World Trade Center, as well as the Rhode Island nightclub fire. And by using the simulation models, I was really trying to understand what happened in these events, as well as trying to answer some of these what if questions or what if scenarios. So for example, one of the motivations for using simulation models in the 2001 World Trade Center disaster was to ask, what if the towers were fully occupied that day? What would the impacts have been? But in the last 8 years, I've been focusing my research on understanding household responses to bushfires. And so that includes understanding the factors that influence people to evacuate or not, as well as the role of emergency communications, among many other factors in these decisions. And the reasons that I wanted to focus on bushfires, I think can be best described by some quotes of the people that we have surveyed as part of our studies. The first quote, "My first warning was my neighborhood being engulfed in flames. I had no idea how very close the fire was to our home until I saw pictures on Facebook." And lastly, someone else told us that we drove through flames blowing across the road 3 different times before reaching the bottom of the mountain. It was the most terrifying experience of my life. And these 3 quotes were taken from a study of a bushfire in the US, in Gatlinburg, Tennessee in November 2016. And this was a fire where almost 14,000 people evacuated, and it caused 14 deaths and 191 injuries. And so up until that point in the US, we hadn't really lost as many civilians as we had in this fire, at least not in the couple of decades before that. And this fire was also unique in that it occurred on the east coast of the US, whereas most of the fires occur on the west coast. So this was a population not as familiar with fire and its risks. It had rapid fire spread, which was fueled by winds and humidity, drought conditions, low humidity and strong winds. The population received multiple mandatory and voluntary evacuation orders for different communities, but the communication overall was hindered by widespread power losses, downed trees and power lines, and intense fire. So really their warnings in this was seeing flames in their neighborhood. And because of that, people were leaving late and encountering very dangerous conditions. So 2 years later, the Camp Fire occurred in Paradise, California. And people were calling this the perfect storm in a negative way, in that there was, the population had a higher proportion of older adults and people with disabilities. And the community, while it had a detailed phased evacuation plan that they practiced and educated the population on, it's not clear whether the plan had been stressed. And what I mean by that was the fire occurred and rapidly blocked 2 out of the 4 routes out of that community. Again, this was a fire with very rapid fire spread, very dangerous conditions for the evacuees. It caused difficulties evacuating critical facilities, and people were stranded. They were forced to take shelter in department stores. So in the Walgreens, actually, in this example, and what that meant was the fire department was outside of these structures, continually wetting the building so that people inside could survive. And someone interviewed from this event noted that the trees to the right of me were on fire and they were just dead stop. There was no one telling us what to do, anything. We were just sitting there. Additionally, the 2019 and the 2020 fire season here in Australia prompted the performance of a number of inquiries, both at the state and the federal level. And these inquiries identified a number of gaps in our understanding. That's essentially areas for more research, if you will, related to evacuation. So I've included just a few quotes from 3 of the inquiries on the screen. First, from South Australia's. And they note that there was an insufficient preparation around evacuations, including assessment of suitable routes to designated locations to reduce risk. From the Victoria inquiry, they recommend that Vic Police and the EM sector enhance evacuation plans and processes. And in that process, consider high-risk areas, triggers, the potential for isolation, non-evacuees and tourists, and compounding events. And then the Royal Commission's report recommended that state and territory governments ensure that those responsible for evac planning periodically review those plans and update them where appropriate, and especially in relation to the adequacies of routes, inabilities to evacuate, risks due to outages and compounding events, and worst case scenarios. And these horrific conditions that people have had to deal with related to fires are not necessarily going away. More and more places around the world are experiencing extreme fire conditions. Just in the past couple of months, we have been seeing stories come out of British Columbia, the fires in Greece and Turkey, the Dixie Fire in California, which I think is now California's largest fire, and villages in Siberia having to evacuate. And the recent IPCC report predicts a future with more intense and frequent fires and longer fire seasons. So what can we do as engineers to protect people from harm? And to answer this question, I like to take a step back and think about the bushfire problem. And I like to think about it as the intersection of these three entities. Just in the same way that we think about building fires, so we think about the intersection of the fire environment in the building, the occupants, and the building itself, right? The built environment, the policies in the building and such. I think we can do the same thing for bushfires, although I think it's a bit more of a complicated problem than we have in buildings. But I think, you know, of it as these three entities: the fire condition, the environmental conditions, the community population, and the community infrastructure. And what I mean by infrastructure is not just the physical, because that's certainly a part of it, the built environment, but also the social infrastructure. So the policies, the procedures in place, the plans, all of the entities that protect the community when a bushfire occurs. And also taking this one step further, thinking about how we might address the problems or the issues within these three entities is really an interdisciplinary problem. So taking the fire and the environmental conditions, for example, we've got multiple disciplines that we can look to and should bring together to solve this quite complex and difficult problem, including climate science, meteorology, ecology, forestry, environmental science, of course, fire science and fire engineering, as well as indigenous knowledge and practices. Kind of in the middle, if you will, between fire and environmental conditions and the community population, we have the disciplines of geography and geoscience, computer science, mathematics and physics are throughout. And then related to the community population, I see sociology and psychology, anthropology and risk communication, although I think some of those disciplines also bridge the gap in between community population and infrastructure. And then when we look on the other side related to community infrastructure, we have civil and electrical engineering, urban and regional planning, emergency management, public policy, political science, and economics, and I am absolutely sure that I have missed some. These are just examples of how bushfire is really an interdisciplinary problem and relies on the kind of the connection and the bridges gapped between these disciplines to really help protect people and protect homes and better understand the fire, etc. So what am I doing in this field? My goal has been, and as an interdisciplinary researcher myself, to work within interdisciplinary teams to protect people from bushfires. One of those projects specifically is the development of a fire and evacuation simulation tool. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. In addition, I have been involved in teams that are collecting data on what people do, collecting data on bushfire evacuation that can be used by this tool, as well as many other aspects of how we protect people, evacuation planning, emergency plans in general, education and training programs, how people make decisions, emergency officials make decisions during evacuation, right, relies on these data and tools. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about the projects I'm working on and how I've been working in these interdisciplinary teams with the goal of better protecting people in bushfires. So first, I am involved in a project that is the goal is to develop a simulation model or tool or platform, really. And the model is called Woonity, and the name comes from Wildland Urban Interface, and it's built within the Unity platform. There's a number of entities and organizations involved in this project, and I'll talk about those in a moment. And the project is funded by NIST. And essentially, it's a simulation tool that couples the fire, the pedestrians, and the traffic. All right, so at the moment, the selected tools that are involved in Woonity are really macroscopic models, more empirical models, which require limited computational ability so that they can be used for both evacuation planning, right, pre-event planning, as well as, we hope, for real-time decision-making and real-time applications. However, the Woonity platform has kind of a modular approach in that components can be replaced, right? So, for example, the macroscopic traffic submodel could be replaced by a more sophisticated or a microscopic model depending upon the user requirements or computational power. And so the basic idea here is that the fire model influences the pedestrian decisions, and it also influences the traffic system, so the availability of routes, for example. And then the pedestrian response determines when, where, and how many people enter the traffic system. So just to acknowledge my my colleagues and everyone else in the team, but especially the folks who are involved in the model development. So I will be digging in a bit more into the Woonity model, and so I want to highlight the work of Jonathan and Enrico from Lund University, as well as I'll be digging into the Peril model, and I'd like to highlight Harry and Guillermo's contributions from Imperial College London. Other colleagues not shown on the screen: Steve Gwynn from Movement Strategies GHD, Max Kinneteter and Nuruddin Beneshu from NRC Canada, and Amanda Kimball from Fire Protection Research Foundation. So a bit about Woonity. It's freeware, and like I mentioned, it's built within the game engine Unity. We're considering open source for the model as well. And as I mentioned, it allows for these submodels, right, to be developed separately and then embedded into the platform as needed. So the fire model currently that's used, although we're working on implementing a more cellular automata model called Behave, is Farsight at the moment. And so this is widely used in the US, for example. It computes wildfire growth and behavior over time under heterogeneous conditions of terrain, fuels, and weather. The model pedestrian movement, so that model moves people from their original location, the assumption is their home, to vehicles. It imports global population data at a 1 kilometer squared resolution. And then Woonity redistributes the population within the space based upon the locations of roads. So assuming that people have access to roads and that they're not living in the middle of a mountain range, for example. You can randomly generate households within the space with an assumption of 1 to 5 people per household. And the outputs of the pedestrian model are the number of people who evacuate before the order is given, after the order is given, and how many people decide to stay, as well as how long it takes for them to move from their original location to their vehicle of choice. And then we have the traffic model, and that simulates movement on the roads. The roads are imported via OpenStreetMaps. And the goal is that we're moving people from their original location to a destination, could be a shelter or another identified location. Right now, only private cars are modeled. And so Woonity automatically generates, we want to understand the max capacity of the roads, automatically generated by Woonity, and this is based on the number of lanes of the road, as well as the road type, and tags from OpenStreetMap. For example, understanding the max road speed is also important, something that Woonity takes into account. Traffic flow is simulated through a speed flow density relationship. Speed is the travel distance covered over a specific time step. Density is the number of vehicles in each unit road, and then flow is the number of cars per unit of time. And so Woonity estimates the average traffic density in sections of the road network for each time step. And it's a linear relationship between density and speeds. So movement between nodes is calculated given the chosen speed based on the density at each time step. And you can also set a percentage of vehicle density that is assumed as kind of a background traffic, and these are people who are kind of flowing in and out of the affected area. For route choice, people can choose either the shortest, the simulated occupants, simulated community members can choose either shortest, fastest, or user-defined route. And their destinations are also user-defined. From the traffic model, the outputs consist of the traffic flow at destinations. So for example, it could be a traffic flow at a shelter, the number of cars in different parts of the road network, evacuation time curves at destinations, and the number of residents remaining in the area, just as some examples of the traffic model output. As well as there's interaction again between the traffic and the fire. So accessibility of a given destination at each time step can be affected by the fire model, for example. So a destination may be blocked or unavailable at a time step, and that may involve rerouting of people. If they're on a certain route, that route becomes unavailable or their destination becomes unavailable, Woonity will then reroute them to another location. So Woonity is also linked to a trigger model. The trigger model is called Peril, and that's the one developed at Imperial College London. And this is an interesting model. It makes it possible to determine one or a set of trigger buffers or boundaries around a community. And that's that blue dotted line on the screen. And that trigger buffer or boundary can be set for a number of different fire scenarios. So if you think about the ASET, RSET concept for buildings, right, the available safe egress time versus the required safe egress time, how long does it take the building to evacuate, for example, we can use the same kinds of concepts in wildfires and bushfires, and especially within Woonity and within the Peril model. So the trigger buffer model compares WRSET and WASET, and the W's for wildfires. These values, so it compares these values for a particular fire scenario to develop that perimeter around a community. And what this perimeter represents is that once the fire of any type of fire scenario actually crosses that boundary, that is an alert to officials that they need to warn their evacuation, warn their community, such that they can evacuate with sufficient time before the fire reaches the community's edge. So in addition to the Woonity platform, the Peril model that helps to identify those trigger buffers, those boundaries around a community, helping officials know when to warn, Woonity also outputs these vulnerability maps. And so we understand the main output of the Wunity platform is to predict evacuation performance, right? Coupling these models and trying to understand clearance times. But these predictions allow the system, this Wunity platform, to also develop these dynamic vulnerability maps. And this represents the capacity for a simulated population to cope with the conditions given the resources available. And so these are essentially based on the number of people in a given area and the required and available safe egress time. So for each simulation time step in Wunity, we calculate the integral of the curve that's displaying the number of people still in the threatened area versus time. And the size of that integral indicates the vulnerability. So the greater the integral, the larger number of people in danger, right? The larger number of people still in that area. And these predicted emergent conditions can be overlaid on a map, as I'm showing on the right of the screen, where the blue indicates a lower number of people, green indicates intermediate, and the red indicates a higher number of people. And so just like any model, Wunity requires data, right? Quite a bit of data for model development, for the user to use, right? For evacuation simulation, and of course, the important verification and validation. The problem is that not a lot of data exist, right? Even at the aggregate level. And so what do I mean by data on what people do in a bushfire? I think about this as an evacuation timeline, like a series of decisions or behaviors that people have to make and take throughout their evacuation timeline. And data are limited on each of these decisions or behaviors. The first being the decision itself. Do people evacuate or not? Departure times and actions. How long do they take before they enter the traffic network if they decide to evacuate? Next, what mode do they choose to leave the area? Next, their route choice, right? So which direction do they go? Which routes do they choose? And finally, where do they go to reach safety? These are kind of the normal decisions that we think about modeling and simulating for our required safe egress time, our clearance time for communities. What's kind of inherently included in this timeline is also whether or not and how long people take information seeking before they make their decision to evacuate. Also not included in this timeline is whether or not people take intermediate trips. And what I mean by this is trips in their mode of choice that aren't directly leading them to safety. And so we know that sometimes people get in the car and they may pick up loved ones, or they may gather supplies and come back home. And what that means is they're still in the affected area. They're using the transportation network, right? So they're taking up capacity on the network, but they're not necessarily driving directly to safety. And then also important is how do their driving behaviors, for example, speed, change if they encounter specific environmental conditions like smoke on the roads. So data at the aggregate level, right, for Wunity, for a macroscopic model, it could be percentage of evacuees that decide to evacuate, percentages of the community or households that decide to evacuate, delay time curves or distributions, percentage of households that use particular modes, percentage that use the fastest route or the shortest route or the familiar route, and the percentage of people that use different types of destination. We can even think about reduction factors, right, when driving through smoke. And then what's not included here are pedestrian speeds. It is included in Wunity, but not necessarily included in my timeline, is how long does it take someone to move from their initial location, their home, to their vehicle before they enter the traffic network. So that's kind of the types of data that a macroscopic model might need to know about the evacuation timeline. More sophisticated models or individual models or agent-based models need different types of data. So they need, for example, the types of factors that start to predict whether or not someone makes a decision. Maybe the development of archetypes. So work in Australia from Ken Strawn and John Gilbert on archetypes. So who are the types of people who are more likely to evacuate or make certain decisions in their evacuation, which then help us to understand how long they may take before they leave the area. And here we're trying to understand who is more likely to take certain modes, how many intermediate trips are some people likely to take more than others, are they more likely to take familiar routes, and why is that the case, those types of things. Without these data, models are forced to make assumptions of what people do in bushfire evacuations, or provide model defaults that simplify the evacuation behavior. And a lot of times, these model defaults look at evacuation behavior in a very optimal way, right? And so some of these model defaults or assumptions that are made are that people initially are located at or near their home, where we know that people could be at work or at school, or that there is a homogeneous population with similar traits and needs, where we know just from building work and building evacuation, we know that that's not the case. Some of these models default or assume that households evacuate together as a unit at the same time. And some of the work that we've done more at a household level and individual level, we know that some households evacuate at different times, or some evacuate and some stay behind, even within the same household. Other types of defaults and assumptions are that there's a sufficient capacity of modes available for evacuation, that households take the shortest or the quickest routes. And from hurricane work, we know that actually people in certain circumstances are more likely to take their more familiar route. And finally, households drive directly to their destination, kind of assuming that they're not taking these intermediate trips where we know in some cases they will. And so when we make these assumptions or kind of view behavior in bushfire evacuation as more optimal and use some of these more optimal defaults, we could be underestimating the needs of people in bushfire scenarios. And we could, like, take planning, evacuation planning, for example. Evacuation plans may underestimate the time that it would actually take a community to evacuate. And when we underestimate the times, we may not necessarily be anticipating for any issues or challenges associated with evacuation from an actual bushfire event. So in addition, my research is focused on collecting data at the household level. So collecting data on decision-making and response during various phases of the evacuation timeline. I want to start first with the evacuation decision, and then I'll get into some of my other work of decisions made along the timeline. So I use, if you've read any of my papers, you've seen the PADM, or the Protective Action Decision Model, and I use this as the foundation for my research. And simply stated, what this says is that people, to make decisions on protective actions, they need to go through a process. So in other words, to shift people's perception of safety, which is kind of our normal state for most people, into a perception of, oh, I need to evacuate, they need to go through a series of stages. So that first they have to receive the cues around them, they need to pay attention to them, and they need to understand them. Also, very importantly, they need to believe that there's a credible threat that they need to do something about. Even more importantly, I may say, they need to personalize the risk. And what that means is they need to think that there is the possibility that their lives or the lives of others could be at risk in this event. And then when they're making decisions on what to do, they have to feel confident that they're able to enact or perform the behavior or the protective action that they're thinking of choosing. And throughout this process, they're constantly receiving cues, and this is causing them to kind of confirm the event, right? Confirm their beliefs, confirm their risk perceptions, so that they then decide upon the protective action they should take. And I should note that most of my research is actually not looking at the aggregate, right? So I just talked all about Wounity and its need for data, aggregated data for this macroscopic model. So I've looked primarily at what people do at the household level, right? But these types of studies, you can always extract aggregate data from them. So when I'm looking at what are the factors that influence people to evacuate or not, I can then extract, okay, here are the percentages of people who actually evacuated, use that for macroscopic models, but develop these more individual agent-based models for the more kind of individual factor-based models for the agent-based simulation tools. So let's get into my first study. And this was focusing on predicting evacuation decisions. And the first thing I did was study that fire that I mentioned very early in my presentation, the 2016 fire that caused 14 deaths and 191 injuries in Tennessee in the United States. So here we were interested in understanding what influenced households to take protective action, and can we predict decision-making of households? And the way we did that, we developed a 20-minute targeted survey. We talked to people in evacuation and fire zones, and we asked them questions about their previous wildfire experience, their preparedness, demographics, what alerts and warnings they received, and what did they do in response to that, and again, what decisions they made finally in their behaviors. We did a lot of work just looking at descriptive statistics, but I want to present to you our linear and logistic regression model analysis today. So this was our goal here is, can we identify the factors that predicted both people's perception of risk? So did they feel personally at risk at the time they made their decision, as well as the factors that predicted whether or not they evacuated? So starting with risk perception, it made sense to us. Yes, seeing flames and embers certainly increased people's perception of risk, as well as feeling like they had a prior awareness of the risk pre-fire in 2016. They then, in the actual event, had a lower risk perception. And this aligns very much with research. Interestingly, though, we found that smelling and seeing smoke resulted in a lower perception of risk. And so although smoke can be categorized in different fires as a very intense physical cue, in this case, the fire had been burning in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park for 5 days before the actual evacuation occurred. So what we're thinking we're seeing here is the opposite effect. So disaster research has shown us that over a series of hazard events, people can become desensitized to certain types of cues. And what we think happened here is they became desensitized to smoke over days, over kind of long-term exposure over days, even within the same event. Looking at our logistic regression, I'll come back to warnings from a trusted source in a moment. As we expected and as theory notes, risk perception was a highly significant predictor of evacuation decision, right? So the higher perception of risk, the higher the likelihood of evacuating. The same was true for gender, in that women were 3 times more likely to evacuate than men, and those who undertook actions to prepare their home were twice as likely to stay, right, than those who hadn't taken preparation. Some of our marginally significant findings were people with an evacuation plan were more likely to evacuate, and those who received warnings from a trusted source were also more likely to evacuate. And it's interesting because warnings from a trusted source linked with risk perception had a negative relationship. So if people received warnings from a trusted source, they were likely to have a lower perception of risk, but they still evacuated. And I actually found the same trend when I studied what people did in the World Trade Center. And if they received warning from a source that they trusted, they actually didn't have to perceive a high level of risk. They believed that person and they evacuated. And we were seeing the same thing happen here. Here's our R-squared for the linear model, and the percentage of our model was capable of predicting 86% of our decisions in the logistic regression. And if anyone's interested in learning a bit more about the study, here are a few papers. I'm happy to share them and send them your way. The logistic regression results are the one in the middle there. And so we did a very similar study of a bushfire that occurred in 2019 in California, and that is the Kincaid fire. And so this fire occurred 2 years after a pretty devastating fire, which was called the Tubbs Fire, which killed over 20 people. And so it was the same population. They had that fire in 2017, and then in 2019, they had to evacuate again because of the Kincaid fire. And the Kincaid fire is the one that we studied. We used the very similar survey as we did in the Tennessee fire, with some additional questions on structure type and their perceptions of how safe they felt their home was. And getting into the regression results again for the Kincaid fire, unsurprisingly, we found factors that predicted levels of risk, like receiving an evacuation order, having a higher perception of threat, like feeling that that there was actually a credible threat, was linked to risk perception, and having a lower perception of safety. If they felt that their home wasn't providing them much in the way of safety, they had a higher perception of risk. And that made sense to us and is aligned with the research. A higher number of adults in the home led to lower levels of risk perception. That's actually what we found aligned with flood literature. And then interestingly, having animals, this was primarily domesticated pets, led to lower levels of risk perception. And we can explain this by people feeling very well prepared. People told us that they felt very well prepared, especially the people who had pets. And this suggests that they felt a higher ability to cope, which means that they didn't necessarily need to feel higher at risk. They felt that they were very much prepared to protect their animals and themselves in this particular fire. Interestingly, we didn't find a link between fire cues and risk perception, but that has to do with the fact that most respondents evacuated before the fire spread to their property, if it spread to them at all. And then just briefly, some predictors of the evacuation decision itself, receiving an evacuation order. Again, a high predictor was the risk perception, similar to what we saw in the other fire. Having a lower having a lower pre-fire perception of safety, again, led to evacuation or higher likelihood of evacuation. Shorter term residence and owning a home and having a lower number of people in the household, all linked to higher likelihood of evacuating. Interestingly, we found that fire cues were linked with a higher likelihood to stay, but again, that is based upon the fact that only the residents who had a chance to see the fire cues themselves were the ones that had already decided to stay in place. So there's our R-squared for that, and we were able to predict 76% of our decisions in our logistic regression model. But I want to kind of end this discussion by highlighting another variable that we were unable to test in our models due to insufficient variance, but that I think is a really, really important one. We looked at our end of survey comments, and this shed light on the role of previous experience on behaviors. So we found that it influenced people's awareness. People told us that after losing their home in the Tubbs fire and evacuating with less than 10 minutes after waking up, I felt informed in this one. It also influenced people's preparedness. They felt that much of their attitude and preparedness was due to the fact that they had this threatening experience with the Tubbs fire. People also told us that it influenced their decision. There were few roads out and it was gridlocked in 2017, so we leave proactively now. And then departure timing. I was still traumatized by a much closer call with the Tubbs fire, so I didn't hesitate to evacuate when the order was given. And so what's really interesting here is I think previous experience, we have a glimpse into how this plays a role in future evacuation behavior. But previous experience is very complicated, right? The Tubbs fire was traumatic. It was it was a deadly fire, but experiences for other people can change, right? There are experiences where people evacuated and nothing happened, or they stayed and they were fine. So I'm very much looking into understanding the nuances of these experiences and how they affect future behavior. And just a little bit on, if you're interested in reading more about our results from the Kincaid fire, we have a quick response grant report from the Natural Hazards Center, and I have a link there. And we've also just submitted our regression modeling results to Safety Science. So hopefully that we'll have good news soon on that. And I'll just end this discussion, I'm looking at the time here, with just two projects that I'm working on very, very briefly to understand not just the decision, but evacuation timing, departure timing, routes, and destinations. And these are also with international teams. The first is looking at GPS data to understand evacuation trends and trajectories. So we're tracking people's location over time in reference to their estimated home location. And we're interested in, and we have a paper out that provides information on evacuation rates, decision rates and timing. And we're also looking at, for future papers, looking at that same data for routing and destination trends. And we're looking at the same fire that we did a survey on, so that Kincaid fire, so that we're able to look to see where the GPS data might not be able to provide us a lot of information, because that's done at the aggregate. Hopefully the survey data will be able to fill in some of the gaps. So I have a link there to our preprint paper on the GPS data, and we also published our data set as well. So some links there on the screen. And then finally, a second project, this was just funded by the National Research Council Canada. And this, I'm working with colleagues from Lund and Imperial and folks in the US, and we're interested in looking at data collection of evacuation from Australian fires and collecting data via surveys and interviews, even maybe evacuation drill observations and GPS data. And we're looking to analyze that data and develop models that support the Woonity model and other evacuation platforms. So I'm looking for PhDs, interested PhDs. I have a PhD scholarship for this project in particular, and we're excited, hopefully get started soon as we find the right person. And then some takeaways. I'm ending here with just some thoughts I have. And I really think, and I hope that you've seen, that fire is an interdisciplinary problem. And disciplines, especially engineering and social science, can work together to solve very difficult problems. Linking these two disciplines, we can help protect people by improving our evacuation plans, right? Those simulation tools and the data to support not just planning, but real-time decision-making, education and training of people in bushfire-prone areas, so that they understand and are aware of their risks and fire threat. And there's plenty to do. Model development, lots of data collection, like that project I just mentioned, and then application. We need to understand, and I have a very small project that is talking to experts on the ground, decision makers and planners, on how do they plan for evacuation, so that we can make sure we're collecting the right data and developing the tools in the right way that meet their needs. So lastly, I'll end with a quote. That's the key to new and good ideas. They come from having a very broad and multidisciplinary range of interests. So thank you very much. I hope I didn't speed through things too quickly. I'm happy to answer questions, and thank you very much for your time and your attention today.
So thank you, Erica, for that wonderful presentation. I'm sure if we were in a seminar room, everyone would be clapping. It was really amazing, and it shows how to address really highly complex problem and how to use different disciplines to address all of those, well, all the challenges, and how to actually come up with an application from there. I'm checking if we have some questions in the chat right now, but in the meantime, I came up with a couple of questions because I had some experience working with Farsight in the
Okay.
past. Yeah, so from the point of view of fire modeling or wildfire modeling, it was complex, or at least for the cases I was studying, to source all those kinds of data for the geographical data. I was wondering, in your studies or for your tool, what's the most challenging data to source in these cases?
So for what, from fire models or just anything in general?
Anything in general, because I know the tool is comprised by several modules, but yeah, if you could give a comment on that.
So I would say, I guess I'll start with the most difficult data to collect, or is that your question?
Yep.
Okay. I would think it's, gosh, so much, because the interesting piece about GPS data, for example, is that it provides a wealth of knowledge, right? It can help us understand, as long as we get enough sampling rate.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the GPS data, we have very low sampling rates, so that's one of the problems. We can get kind of a bird's eye view, right, of evacuation trajectories, and we can get trends. The issue is trying to understand why, right? So if we don't understand kind of the factors that influence these trends, then we can't get to some of these agent-based models, right? These more sophisticated individual-based models, which is where I really want to see us go, because if we're not there, then we can't get to prediction. If we get to the place where we're thinking about, all right, here are the factors that help us to understand why people make decisions, then we can get to the place where we're thinking about prediction. And that's where I want to see us going. Unfortunately, that's like trying to get at the household level and individual decision making, and which is important and possible, but time consuming, and not as easy just to take a data set in the aggregate and try to make sense of all that. So yeah, I think it's a complicated problem, but that's what makes it interesting and fun, and also, you know, that it will have great impact at the end of the day, and hopefully will save lives. So for all those reasons, I'm going to keep at it.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, like keeping it in balance between specific and also useful.
That's
for
right.
communities, actually. Okay, that's pretty interesting. Yeah, thank you. And I had another couple of questions, maybe related to cultural background,
Oh,
and
yeah.
maybe how it could affect the speed of evacuation of people, because it might not be the same to talk to people in certain countries, or even in certain communities, or certain ages, like range of ages. So yeah, I was wondering if you have made some studies on that. Or...
Yes, so absolutely. The cultural piece is really important, and something that I think we focus quite a bit of our efforts on understanding evacuation and sometimes mainstream populations, or populations that are affected. I'm thinking mainly from the U.S. You know, we're interested in who's going to answer our survey, right? But reaching out to different types of populations is so important, because there's so many different things and so many different factors that play a role in decision making. The first one being policy, right? So the policy in Australia for evacuation is different from the policy in the US. It's mandatory in the US. And so that plays a big role. Here, it's not. So
okay.
if we're not taking that into account, then that's kind of the first problem. And some of the more remote communities, for example, or communities, non-English speaking communities, or other types of communities, or indigenous communities, there's a lot of times where we think about the vulnerabilities of a community without the capacity. So sometimes, you know, we have to understand, is there an amazing social network, right? So that what we might think is a vulnerability is actually that they've got it all set up such that they're fine, right? They have the resources they need and can evacuate safely. And so taking all that into account, what is vulnerable in one population might not be in another. Certainly policies play a role when we're thinking about all of this important work. So culture plays a role. Lots of other factors do as well. So thanks for answering that, asking that question.
Well, thank you for answering. I can see in the chat actually that Peter Johnson
Peter.
has a comment. Maybe let me mute him. Yeah. Oh. Yeah. Oh.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Oh, I am so familiar. I have read before I came to Australia. I made sure to read all of the work. I'm very familiar with the amazing Black Saturday work, but then also a lot of the work from Jim McLennan and Josh Whitaker, and even from the latest Black Summer fires. So yes. I have been very focused. I mean, I'm presenting the work from the US today because that's what I did before I got here. But I'm very much interested in working with a lot of the experts here and with all of the Australian knowledge on evacuation, 100%.
That's good. There were just, yeah, a very rich resource of interviews taken, going to visit people on their visiting sites very quickly after Black Saturday to get these very detailed interviews taken with people, survivors, I guess. And I think it's probably a rich resource there. I've got no idea how well it's been looked at. I know in part it has, but there's probably a whole lot of useful information in that. The other question was, have you looked at whether someone has their property insured or not as part of a decision making? We seem to be indications from Black Saturday that made some difference as to whether people evacuated or not. Is that something you've looked at?
Great questions. I want to address the first one actually. And I'm glad you brought this up, Peter, because when I put that slide up about the data and how we're limited in data across the evacuation timeline, I should have first and foremost said that actually most of the data we have is on the evacuation decision. And so there's actually quite a wealth of data and theory that have been developed on that decision itself. Of course, we can always use more data on different types of populations as well as different countries. And so I've looked at a lot of that, and a lot of the research that we've done in the States, we've always then compared it with the amazing literature done here in Australia. And we see a lot of similarities in the factors that influence things there and here. So thanks for bringing that up. And then insurance. So I haven't used that, I have not asked that question in my survey, but I agree. It's something that I want to add. And I think it's important to add. I've asked that question in other types of surveys. I have a project with QUT where we're looking at emergency communications and the role that videos play in decision making. And we do ask about insurance. And so that's something that we'll look into, but not in the two studies that I presented here. And I think it's a good point. It's something that I'll be adding to my survey.
That's great. Thank you for, wonderful presentation. Brilliant.
Yeah, thanks for joining.
Yeah.
Thank you, Peter, for your question and for the talk. I think we have another question in the chat by Brian Ashley. He thanks you for your presentation, and he wonders if you have found if fire services are forthcoming with the data they have on past events.
Yeah, thanks, Brian, for that. That's a great question. The way that I've interacted with emergency officials, at least in the U.S. in the past, is to ask them for us to interview them, right, for their experiences, the decisions that they've made in the fire. And while I think they've been really interested in working with us and talking with us, the problem with the fires that we've studied, especially the Tennessee fire, is when we were doing this study, there were quite a number of lawsuits that were pending, especially since people lost their lives. And so the people who worked that fire were unable to speak with us. And so that's really the data that I wanted to gain from them, is what information did they have? How did they make their decisions on when to warn? What tools did they use? What fire model information did they? I was able to speak with a few people, but it just wasn't enough to actually develop a project where we could actually report, develop a report where we could document without identifying anyone. So we needed a larger sample than we had. But I think that they're a wealth of knowledge that is crucial to these studies. And I've had better luck, I would say, in some of the work that I did when it was full-scale investigations with NIST, because we had kind of the ability to talk to people a little bit freer than if it was just kind of an academic study. So yeah, I guess that's all I can say about that. Is I wish we had more. I wish we had a higher sample, a higher number of people who could talk with us after these fires, because I think that's the only way we can get at improving the emergency communication system in the US. Because a lot of these, they weren't using the mobile alerts. And it's important to know why, but we didn't get to answer that question.
All right. Thank you for your answer. And we have another question. Yeah, it's related to if fire early warning
Nima.
systems. Yeah,
Hi. Sorry, early warning systems. Is he able to, are you able to ask the question, Nima? Because when you say early warning systems, what do you mean? Do you mean before evacuation is actually called for, or?
Hi, Erica.
Hi.
How are you? Thank you
Good.
for your presentation.
You're welcome.
Yes, I want to ask you about the fire early warning system, like earthquake warning system.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
So really the warnings that were given or that are given to residents, it's sort of an early warning system process. So in California, there's a tiered alert system. I know it's the same here in Australia. It's not the same system, but I know it's a tiered system here too. So people did get warnings, which is the tier before order. And that is so that's in the California fire, I should say. People in the Tennessee fire didn't really get the opportunity to receive the official warnings. But in California, people were able to get a warning which says, hey, there's a likelihood that you're going to have to evacuate, and if you need more time, you should evacuate now. And so that's what the warning means. And then after that, some period of time when people really needed to go, when the officials decided, all right, you need to leave, that's when they got the order to leave. And that's the mandatory order that they have to follow. So in a sense, I guess that can be equated to an early warning system, in that there's this, hey, we want to let you know that you are likely to get evacuation order in the future, so you need to start preparing.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
All right. It seems there are no more questions in the chat. I had a last, maybe, I don't know if it's that related, but at some point you were mentioning the reliability of the source for the evacuation. Is there any study made on the impact of social media or fake information on the decision-making process of people?
Yes, a lot of great work here, actually. Done at QUT, for example, they have looked at a lot of work in even conflicting cues, right? We get this from social media, but I look outside and it looks fine, right? It's not raining yet, but you're telling me that I need to react to a flood. So yes, there has been studies done on the impact of social media on what people think about the message and then, you know, what they intend to do in response to it. And then the source. So there has been work and continually studies done asking who is a credible source for a particular community, or who is a credible source across the board. And we just did a study of an Australian population asking for floods and fires. It was state government, the Bureau of Meteorology, for example. So the problem is that the credible source isn't the same for everyone. And so it may differ depending upon the population. It might be it might be someone from the media. It might be a champion from the community, maybe someone from you know, local, I don't know, from a worship community or something like that. So it changes, and it's important for the community leaders and decision makers to know who their community views as the official or credible source.
All right. Yeah, who influences the opinion of the
That's
people,
right.
whatever the way they
That's
do
right.
it.
Yep. And in the US, for example, they did a national survey years back, and there was no main credible source for everyone, but the highest source, I think they got 35%. That was the highest category. It was the fire service. So
right. That's good. Well, at least a formal authority somehow.
That's right.
Yeah. All right. So if there are no more questions, I would like to thank you, Erica, again for this presentation, and thank to all of our attendees for coming.
Yes, thank you for your questions too. And it's always something, you know, they're always great. They help remind me of, oh yes, I forgot to mention that. Or, but it was really fantastic being able to present and have this discussion with you all today. And so thanks for your time.
Thank you again. And yeah, and before everyone leaves, with your permission, I would like to share our next seminar with all of our attendees. So we're going to be talking about the finalization of the European approach to assess the fire performance of facades. I know it's not very related to the topic today, but yeah, that's what we here. We try to cover different topics. Fire safety engineering, such a broad topic. So yeah, again, thank you for your presentation, and looking forward to have another one someday on campus. Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you. Everyone, have a good weekend.
Nice seeing
Bye-bye.
everyone.